listening to C-Suite Unplugged, a podcast by the Business Council of Alberta, where the province's top executives share their career story, what's happening at their companies, and speak candidly about the most pressing business issues. I'm your host, Adam Legge, and in each episode, I sit down with Alberta's leading CEOs, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders to explore their path to the top and what they're focused on right now. Enjoy the show. One of the most challenging parts of being a leader is ensuring that a company or project can live up to the hype or attention that it generates. While today's guest is part of a legacy of leaders who put blood, sweat, and tears into the completion of this project, he not only played a key role in its completion, but now as CEO, plays a key role in ensuring that the project operates at its optimal level. Today on C-Suite Unplugged, I'm joined by Mark Maki, Chief Executive Officer of Trans Mountain Corporation, the company behind one of Canada's most important, watched, and talked about projects of the century so far, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Mark was appointed CEO in the fall of 2024 after serving as the company's chief financial officer for several years. Before joining Trans Mountain, he spent more than 3 decades at Enbridge, holding senior leadership roles across Canada, the US, including president of Enbridge Energy Partners and senior vice president of finance. In our chat, we explore Mark's career journey and leadership perspective, then step back to look at the forces shaping the future of Canada's energy industry, as well as the TMX project itself. A note to our listeners, this conversation was recorded on December 10th, 2025, before the recent developments involving the United States and Venezuela. Well, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Adam, thank you for having me over. Looking forward to this.
It's going to be a great conversation. So, Mark, before we start, briefly tell us about Trans Mountain Corporation, what it does, and the role you play.
Sure. Well, I'm the CEO of Trans Mountain and relatively recent install into that position. I'm sure Trans Mountain story is well understood by everybody, but our primary business is really transportation of crude oil from the Edmonton market hub over to Burnaby and the Westridge Dock, and then we have a spur line that goes into Washington State to serve the refining complex down there. So that's kind of our core business. And then we have a storage business in Edmonton as well. It's another part of our portfolio. Very focused on refined products and crude oil transportation. That's what we do.
Yep. A major piece of Canada's energy infrastructure, getting our products to places not the U.S. So we'll talk a little bit about where your stuff goes in a little bit. But first, let's go to you and your life and your career and tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you born and raised?
Sure. Like one of your previous guests here, I grew up in the Midwest U.S. That's where I'm from originally. You'll hear a little bit of the accent in there, and people in the Southern U.S. will say, "You must be a Canadian." They'll bring that up. So American by birth, I'm a Canadian by adoption. So the country was kind enough to bring me, on board as a Canadian a while back.
Glad we did.
Yeah. And that was, really a function of, lots of time in the country, working in the country with my prior employer. And it just, felt like you needed to be part of the fabric. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, I'm happy to be an adopted Canadian.
Yeah. So what part of the Midwest?
I grew up on the Great Lakes, so Duluth Superior, for those who know their geography. So one of the unique things about that area, especially as it relates to Canada, is, shared history. Mm-hmm. So, the Hudson's Bay Company or the Northwest Company would have been part of the history there. One of the cities is named after a voyageur. And so lots of shared history. There's always an affinity, I would say, to Canada. Anybody who's on the northern tier. And that's true. So I grew up with that. I grew up with, you knew who the key hockey players from Canada, Gordie Howe, and so on. And so, it was part of, the fabric of the upper Midwest.
Yeah. The Midwest and Minnesota sounds like you generate good oil and gas executives.
Apparently there's a couple, that are floating around here.
Yeah. Exactly. Mark, what was your first job? What was the first thing that garnered a paycheck for young Mark Maki?
So setting aside all the stuff he did as a kid, shoveling snows and all that and mowing people's lawns. My first real job, I worked my way through university. That was part of what I had to do.
Yeah. What did you take in university?
Was originally really an engineer. Mm-hmm. So I started out in local university, doing the math, calculus, physics, that kind of thing, your core engineering program stuff. And a couple of years into it, I realized that I had been accepted to University of Wisconsin-Madison. That was where I was going to head, but I didn't have the heart to leave, the nest at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So some of it was family driven, and so I stayed close and I became an accountant. That was my degree, accounting and finance. Part of it was, jobs, career. It looked like a good place to be as a kid graduating from university at the time. And along the way, I had an internship with a predecessor to Enbridge. And they brought a bunch of students in, and it was around the time, given my vintage, you'll start to do the math here. But it was computers were coming into the office. So PCs. There was, okay, he's got some background in PCs from a prior job. He's good accounting person. Let's bring him in, internship, get good experience. Internship was done. They kind of came to me and said, can you stay? Would you want to stay? I said, well, I got to finish my degree. And they said, well, you can work part-time, go to school, finish it off, and then come to work for us. So I had a little bit of time to my degree path, but it was, a role. So my first paycheck was from effectively what was then Interprovincial Pipeline.
Interesting.
My first bonus check came from a guy here in town who's the business school is named after, which is Richard Haskane. So I got that somewhere early in my career. And one of the boss people pulled me aside and said, you write Mr. Haskane a note, and you write Mr. McNeil a note, who was Richard's CFO at the time, Brian McNeil. And so those folks very early in career, and you see all kinds of people who fell from his tree, here in town. And so, he had an influence. And from him, I would say it was hard work ethic.
Yeah.
And we'll get to other people in a minute who fell from the same tree.
Yeah, there you go. So maybe let's continue the journey from recent graduation, and let's get us to where you are today at Trans Mountain.
Yeah, so it's an interesting journey. And like others who you've had here, the important thing I would say along the way is I was given an opportunity to do something different, to stretch a bit, in terms of skills, and challenge the individual more. One of those early moves for me was after initially, working in, finance and accounting. A natural adjunct to that was the regulatory space. So rate cases and, cost of service filings and the old world of rate regulated businesses. And so I came up in that and learned that, and was asked to relocate to Edmonton from the upper Midwest. And at that time, given family situation, I had to say no. Pat Daniel, who was then leader of Enbridge, said, I'll ask you again. I mean, he appreciated the honesty and the reasons why. So he came back a little bit later and said, I need you as controller in Edmonton. Can you go? Yes. And so looked at it as an adventure. So a few years there, then along the way, Enbridge had acquired a company in Texas, rebranded itself along the way, acquired a company in Texas. And I'd done some of the diligence on the enterprise that was being bought. And he says, would you move again? Go to Houston. So that would have been in 2001 or so. I said, sure, I'd love to go. And so down we went. And that was a great experience. I was there a long time, basically 2001 to 2015. Initially as controller for the business, then the CFO for the business unit, CFO for one of the public companies that was part of Enbridge at the time, and then eventually became president of that business unit in due course. And then was asked by El Monaco, can you come to Calgary, help with a few things we got going on here? And that was around the 2015 timeframe. Worked a variety of different things. Al was really good about, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? And he would bounce you around. And at some point on the career, the merger with Spectra happened, and it was time for me to do something different. I'd reached a point in career where I could stay at Enbridge. I loved the company, loved who I worked with, but I wanted something a little different. Right. And at the time, Ian Anderson, who was CEO at Trans Mountain, was looking for a CFO to help them with what he imagined at the time was going to be a path back to the private sector. Yeah. Then along the way, project went in through a very tortured, evolution. Dawn Farrell came in after Ian retired, and Dawn got the thing across the finish line. And then she's gone off to other interesting things.
Yes.
But for me, going to Trans Mountain was about service to country that had adopted me. And I was thrilled to go to work for Trans Mountain. And I'm really thrilled to have been tapped for the role I have now. And then if I go back to the early young me, I never in a million years would have figured out I would end up here. I would have said, I'm going to be a senior accountant, and I would have been happy with that.
Yeah. Partner or something at a PwC. And it's funny. I think so many of us, as you get longer in your career, you realize that the place you are now isn't where you thought you'd be.
Yeah.
I'm definitely one of those people. I'm not where I thought I would be at all, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a book, an old one now, called Arc of Your Ambition. Trying to figure out what that is for you. And then again, read many, many years ago, I'm like, I would never have gotten it right had I guessed early, and even at mid-career, I wouldn't have known. Yeah.
Mark, you've made some really significant moves, first with Enbridge and now with Trans Mountain. What do you credit? Obviously, you want to be good and you want to be recognized, but what do you think were some of the factors of your success and the moves and the growth and the escalation of responsibility and titles, et cetera? Well,
there's certain things I think everyone innately has, they're born with, they have, or it's just how they're wired. So that we can talk a little bit about that. But I think along the way, I had really a supportive leadership team that said, okay, let's try him there. And then the willingness to be able to okay, yes, it might be a little scary, it may be a little uncomfortable, but the chance to try. And then knowing if it didn't work out, you had a safe place to land. And I think that I carry that around with me still. Like if someone goes into a role and it doesn't quite work out, but they were a great person somewhere else, you find a place to get them back. You don't throw a family member off the back of the boat.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's a kind of piece of the wiring. So those early people, challenging me to do something different helped a lot. Yeah. And then along the way, then seeing what made a good leader. And I could reflect on a number of people, Al Monaco, it's discipline. No one works harder than that guy.
Yeah.
Okay. So there was that. And then discipline, careful studier of fundamentals, risks and potential upsides, very disciplined. Pat Daniel, leader, I would say a big influence on me. And with him, it was, I think he could see ahead of the game. He could see around the corners. It's an expression Don Farrell uses.
Yeah.
I thought he did that extraordinarily well. He saw things like, he was very early on the renewable energy, and that was important to him personally. He talked about offsetting the carbon footprint of the oil pipeline through green.
Right.
And they more than overshot that by epic amounts. And so I look at those two CEOs and say, they both had an influence on how I turned out, because each of them, everyone leaves a mark.
Yes,
right?
Indeed.
And so they both did. And there's others along the way. Richard Bird, financial discipline. He was a CFO at Enbridge. And I could go on. There's a whole long list of folks.
Yeah. It sounds like you've done a few times move from that CFO to a senior role, both at Enbridge and that business unit, and also with Trans Mountain now. Mm-hmm. What's that transition like to go from CFO? Because I know many people do it, and it can be a common move in an organizational structure. So what would you tell people about what that move is like to go from CFO to the ultimate top role in the organization?
Well, first off, I would say if anyone who's trying to do that, get a good CFO to replace you. That's key to it. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself buried back in what your old job was. You got to find a way to separate from that. And then I think the other thing that's really important is remember what it is. The business isn't the numbers. It's relationships with customers. It's relationships with communities that you impact or serve. Mm-hmm. And then it's the workforce. Everyone who's there, it's all part of a team. That team's got to work well together. And so what I think is mission critical to anybody who's making the transition to CEO is don't lose touch with the business.
Right.
So one of the things I enjoy absolutely more than anything else is when I get away from the office and I'm out in the field. Mm-hmm. We've had a number of dignitaries visit Westridge.
Yes.
What I really like is when I go there by myself. And then you just talk to people that are on the dock. We're bringing in ships now at night unloaded, and you talk to the people on the dock, and it's different. It's a different operation than during the day. And so what are they concerned with? And you hear from them, and those things land. Yeah. And then you see the scale, what we do, how complicated it is, how dedicated those people are. So I would encourage anybody, no matter where they come from, you have to have time in the field.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is it hard to shift from sort of largely that pure numbers function, the finance and accounting of the organization, to the big picture, the strategy, the vision, that we're looking around the corners, those sorts of?
I think you have to have the right cast there with you. And I've been fortunate whether it was running Enbridge Energy Partners or here in the role now at Trans Mountain, I've got good people with me. And it's a team. It's not one individual that through Herculean effort makes everything happen.
Yeah.
It's a team. So you have to have a good team. And I mentioned the CFO, and I'm not kidding. You have to have a good CFO because then you get away from the things that are your comfort zone. Yeah. It's always nice to kind of yo-yo back into it. Oh, I need to just sort of see something.
Yeah.
Because it's a comfort thing. But you have to have somebody there who's in a good position to take over for you. So if it's a chief operating officer who becomes CEO, he needs a good chief operating officer.
Yeah.
If it's a chief commercial officer and she goes up to the CEO role, well then whoever replaces her needs to be in a position to replace her, so she doesn't have to dive back into it. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it easy, and then you can focus on strategy and what's next, and think about what's coming for the company. What are the fundamentals telling you? In all your experience in the business, what's next? And what should we be doing? How should we be setting ourselves up for that?
Yeah. Mark, you talked about enjoying going to Westridge and talking to people, just yourself. How would you describe your leadership style in terms of engaging with your team and keeping them engaged and motivated and excited about what they're doing?
Sure. Well, I think it's a lot about what can we be. Like we can be a lot more every day that we perform and take good care of the customers, take good care of the communities, good care of the environment, keep our relationships with communities and Indigenous nice and solid. We earn trust. We earn the right to do more. And in our case, we want to expand our system. We want to grow our system. The trust of the owner is important. And so that has been something we've been very focused on over the last year, is getting that trust with the owner. Look, this is what we want to do, and here's why.
Mark, what does a day in the life of a CEO, Mark Maki, look like?
Yeah, good question. Fundamentals. I start with the morning typically with reading. The people that works close to me is like she'll scan what's out there in the world and just say, you need to look at this. You'll be really interested in this. I showed you this one, and sorry for the audio, but it hits home for me about how rough it is in the energy space still. Really, it's fundamental. So what's going on in the world around us, that'll impact our business over the long term. So fundamentals is the way the day starts. What's new in the news. Then how's the business doing? And so it'll be a review of what were our deliveries, what was our activity, and what's going on with our customers. So that's that would be the beginning of the day. Then of course there's management external, so stakeholder, our shareholder and their representatives, the communities that we impact, the province, the provincial interactions that we have, and then with the leadership team. What's happening in each of your areas? What do we need to focus on? That's a weekly thing, and making sure people are resourced right. Yeah. And are we progressing everything we're working on according to plan?
Yeah. What outside the office keeps Mark busy? Do you have any hobbies or interests or things that give you recharge your batteries, so to speak?
Oh yeah. One of the things I've taken up over the last year, which is fun and I enjoy it, it's a great kind of decompress thing, is to hop on the paddleboard up at Bonus Park, paddle down to where the house is, more or less. And then hop off and drag the paddleboard up to the house, plop it down, then get on the bike and go get the car.
Oh, fun.
And so that's you can't do that now. The river's a little cold.
Yeah. A little cold.
And full of ice. So skiing outdoors. I love the outdoors. This is one of the reasons, again, you come to this country and you realize how incredibly blessed Canada is. The natural resources, the water, the air, the land, the mountains, the oceans. I mean, all of it, you just there's nothing like it. Yeah. And so I love all that. So outdoor time is like a big part of me decompressing, and to spend time with family doing that is a big part of what I like to do.
Yeah. I've seen a few people do the paddleboard down the bow. I've done still lake water stuff, but this is moving current. Is it?
Yeah,
must be pretty tricky.
It is fun. I got to tell you, I'm not one for standing up on the thing. I kneel.
Oh, okay.
And buzz down. Yeah, I like the river changes based on the time of year. Either it's really humming or it's low, and you got to pick your channel. Otherwise, you hang up. But it's always a little different. The way maybe the old pilots in the old days thought about the Mississippi River. You knew by the time of year like where the paddle boat needed to go. To me, the boat's a lot like that. Changes every day.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day I'll generate the courage to try a moving current.
It is very relaxing. It is very relaxing.
I'll have to give it a try. Mark, let's switch to kind of the big picture around the energy system in Canada. So you spoke a few minutes ago about bringing your shareholder up to speed on bring them up the curve was the term you used around. Maybe map out for people, what is having given your career at Enbridge and Trans Mountain, what is the nature of the energy linear infrastructure in this country, and where does it go, and where are some of the points of origin for the commodities? Maybe just kind of a big picture sketch.
Sure. With respect to refined products, basically, I'm going to focus on crude oil only. Sure. Refined products is basically refinery out. So I'm going to talk about getting product to the refinery centers. So the way the infrastructure really evolved across North America was, and if you think about the history of oil in North America, Pennsylvania, Texas were kind of the big kind of initial hubs, and Canada came a little bit later. But the big hubs were south in the Gulf of Mexico, Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia. In the case of the Canadian side, relatively modest population, incredible resource, And so the pipeline network developed in a way initially to basically bring oil to the Great Lakes, to my old hometown, so to speak, right? And for a while, they tinkered it across the Great Lakes because it made sense. But they quickly realized as the resource grew in Canada, like we needed a pipeline all the way across, the top of the U.S. So the initial choice, and I'm sure if Canada had its way and could go back in time and tell people to do something a little different, it would be to build an all Canadian route.
Yep.
But at the time, they stopped at Duluth Superior because it was easy to hop on a boat and then go from there. That lasted a couple years, and then they realized, you know what, much more production. So the Canadian network largely grew up around refining needs in Ontario, Quebec, and some interior Canada, but also the U.S. Midwest. And coming the other direction from the south, from Texas, were a number of big oil pipelines that brought oil, say, into the Chicago market. So Chicago is a big hub. Yeah. Texas refining center is another big hub. California is a big hub. And along the eastern seaboard, there was as well. So the oil pipeline network basically built from supply source to refining hubs. And Trans Mountain was a piece of that in its time, too, with Edmonton to Vancouver, where there were multiple refineries. Now there's just one.
Yeah.
And then the refining complex down in Washington State. And over time, Trans Mountain's fortunes have ebbed and flowed, tied to Alaska. So when Alaskan oil started, Trans Mountain was maybe moving 400,000 a day in its heyday. And when Trans-Alaska came on, then it fell way off. Again, if you had the benefit of a time machine, may go back and tell the Trans Mountain people back decades ago, don't take a whole bunch of stuff out of service because it's going to be needed again. And here we are. So the network evolved. And as Canada's impact in North America grew and grew and grew, and again, the great success of the oil sands, what happened to a lot of the infrastructure from the Gulf of Mexico north? It reversed. It reversed or shut down. So a big example of this is the Capline system, which goes from offshore New Orleans or offshore Louisiana up to basically the Chicago market. That's its kind of terminus, or mid Illinois. That line today is in the other direction, moving Canadian North Dakota oil south. So what happened, and part of the kind of bringing new people coming into new seats in Ottawa up the curve, was the world is different now because Canada's had such a huge impact. The upper Midwest, as an example, or refining centers like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Chicago, Detroit, Toledo, Eastern Canada, are incredibly dependent on Western sourced oil.
Yes. Yeah. How much moves from Canada to the U.S. versus Canada to other global markets? Obviously, Trans Mountain is the key West Coast terminus. There are points that, as you say, go south into the U.S., some underneath some of the Great Lakes and what have you, and then out into the eastern seaboard. So much of the conversation we talked earlier has been about how much we do send to the United States versus other markets. But from a total volume standpoint, even roughly, how much goes to the States versus other parts of Canada? Or
so as I think about the markets, like let's maybe take the biggest system is Enbridge, so 3.2 million-ish a day is what moves on that system. And I will forget the Central Canada and Eastern Canada demands, but it's probably in that 500,000 a day range. And then you've got the Western demand, which is probably in a similar ballpark. So what moves on Enbridge, I would say 2.5 probably stays in the States or it goes to export on the Gulf Coast. What they have going to the export in the Gulf Coast today is probably largely headed to India or Europe. And when Trans Mountain started up, any Chinese pointed barrels then would have flipped to our system most likely because of transit time across the continent and then transit time on the water. So much faster on our system. India is a toss-up. I think it's probably equal, but the tanker size being larger in the Gulf of Mexico, getting to India from there probably makes sense to go a different corridor. If you go to our system specifically, this is one of the things we're really happy with is in the month, say, of we had 777,000 a day in the third quarter moving on the system against a capacity of 890. So that's the best quarter we've had since startup. And in September, October, November, the system will be running somewhere close to 95% full. So our capacity is 890. So we're talking 840, 840-ish on the system. That's faster than I would have thought coming into the year in terms of seeing that level of activity. Now, it's going to be seasonal. And then all those barrels, So some of it lands in British Columbia, big round numbers between refined products and crude, about 100,000 a day. And then about 200,000 a day plus goes to the Washington State refining complex. Everything else would go to water.
Yeah.
And when it goes to water, about 60% of it goes to Asia, 40% goes down to California. And a little bit goes to Alaska, of all places.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Mark, so much of what has been talked about in Alberta has been about trying to get Canada, our fellow Canadians, to understand the importance of getting our resources to other markets. And how do you explain that to folks that may just say, I don't understand why we need to be shipping oil to other places in the world? And so how do you tackle that?
I'm going to start at the highest level I can think of. And we had a chance to go present not long after startup of the system to the Bank of Canada board of directors.
Oh, great.
This was fun, by the way. So you're in the room, you're kind of looking around, wow, there's some incredibly smart people in the room. I feel like I don't belong in there. But we talked about what the system was doing, where the oil was going. And then a comment by Governor Macklem at the end was, you guys need to understand this. You show up in the national numbers. This makes a difference.
Yeah.
So at the highest level, in the grand scheme of things, as challenging and as fraught with issues as our expansion was, it moves the meter for the country.
Yes.
Wow. And so that is a starting point for why energy matters. It's the fastest thing we can flywheel up, in terms of, a lot of things take a lot of time, to get up. If it's a critical minerals facility, oil and gas production can come online relatively quickly if we can get out of our own way.
Yeah.
And so that I think is like the tone has changed a lot with the leadership in Ottawa now.
Yeah. Yeah. The bank has been quite public about the contribution of the project to Canada's GDP numbers. I think they've been quite public about the contribution to the national coffers. So what that's enabled to do is lift all boats in many ways, right? It's generated more revenue for government to be able to distribute on programs that Canadians value, like healthcare and defense and infrastructure. So, and the notion that Canada is one of the last bastions of responsible, democratic supplies of energy that we can get around the world. And, one of the arguments that I think is important for so many to understand is that if Canada doesn't produce it, someone else will. So it's not like Canada's restriction of that energy supply is all of a sudden just going to make any sort of difference in the geopolitical energy mix. It's going to be replaced by a Russia, a Saudi Arabia, a Venezuela, somewhere. So why not get it from Canada and in the process generate prosperity within the country? Absolutely. Couldn't say it any better than that. And I really think the ability, people have to understand it's a global market for oil. And the demands go beyond transportation fuels too. And this is the other thing. We do the morning reading and what are people saying. There was something today, I think, in the media about, burning of oil sands. And it's like, that's not always the end state for the production. And this is especially true for barrels pointed at China, where more and more of it goes into the petrochemical complex. And that becomes parts of cars or tires or carbon fiber for airplanes or any number of other things that have nothing to do with gasoline, diesel, or jet, particularly in China, because given the amount of, and I know you know this, the investment in new refining and then new petchem complexes, and they're basically married to each other. Yep. This is a big difference. And so when the oil leaves our system and we track it through and we see where it goes, it's going to these highly integrated facilities. So they can throttle up gasoline, diesel, and jet when it's needed, and they can dial back to petrochemical when that's needed. Yeah. And the flexibility they're trying to get to with those facilities is way higher. So that they're shooting for a 40% petchem yield now, their objective is to get to 70 or 80. And you think about it, well, get into your electric car and look around. You're surrounded by plastics. Plastics, yeah, exactly. Yeah, carbon fiber and other cool things that come from hydrocarbon. Yeah. So like this is, I think, one of the big things that people are missing is the automatic assumption should not be it's going to be burned. And that when I saw that in the article today, I'm like, oh, here we go again. Yep. Yep. Yeah. It's that term I think Alberta Innovates coined, sort of bitumen beyond combustion perspective. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Right on. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Mark, in terms of at its peak, you said you're about 890,000 barrels.
Capacity,
Today, yeah. Where, on a rough percentage basis, where is that? Where are those barrels going globally?
I mentioned that, the 100-ish in kind of the BC market, and then, 200-ish plus down to 200 to 250, I would say, down to Washington State. And then everything else goes off the dock. 60% goes to Asia.
Yeah.
The other 40 someplace in the United States. Typically, California is a big market, but some actually goes to Washington. I mentioned Alaska. The odd cargo goes there. And the first time we saw that, we're like, well, you're kidding me. But they needed it there for blending.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting where the barrels are going, but the increase in interest in Asia is very strong. And one of the untapped markets, I think, for Canadian is India.
Mm-hmm.
Strong interest there. We've had lots of different Chinese potential, we're interested in Canada. They'll come in. I know they talk to the producers, but they also talk to us because they're trying to understand what's my route to home, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so understanding like what we're planning for capacity additions is high on their agenda. Like, what are you up to grow the system? When are you going to be full, and when are you going to expand?
Yeah. No, we hosted and you were there, the High Commissioner of India to Canada, and the message was basically, we'll buy whatever you can get to us. It was pretty clear. Yeah. So India, I think, is definitely a growth market.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly, I think there's a high interest in Canada given rule of law. It's the incredible resource that's here, and it also fits a bill with the heavy oil.
Mm-hmm.
There is an interest. Heavy oil is short in the global markets. You think about other producers of it. Venezuela. Well, we have issues. Mexico's been in decline for a long time, and it wasn't unusual. Again, I go back earlier in my career. Mentioned the network came from the south to the north.
Yeah.
It was not unusual in the early days to see Venezuelan oil end up in the Chicago market or Mexican as well. That has changed. Those conduits aren't there anymore. They've been bumped out by Canadian. Canadian is now competing in the Gulf Coast with those barrels, but those barrels are in short supply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the other reasons I think Trans Mountain is really important to the country, is it gives it another avenue out. In the event Venezuela does come back down the road, it's one of the, depending on how you want to count, one or two in the global supply potential.
Mm-hmm.
It will compete with Canadian barrels. So Canada needs other markets. I've been preaching that message for decades.
Yeah. No, it's clear. We definitely do need to diversify our basket of trading partners. Mark, you've been in this business all across North America. Maybe share with our listeners what is unique or different about building an operating pipeline in Canada versus, say, the United States. And that could be everything from the geographic and weather challenges to regulatory process and burden. Obviously, the Trans Mountain project was a massive project over some incredibly challenging terrain. How would you juxtapose, say, Canada and the U.S. and what makes it challenging, different, unique, et cetera?
First off, and we'll get to the underlying reasons, but as a starting point, called an old colleague down in Texas because they'd announced a project to build an NGL pipeline from one side of the state to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's all inside Texas, so let's just start with that.
Yeah.
But it was, you're going to be done in 2 years. Yes. They announced it 2 years to done. So let's just start with that. So there's some technical reasons, but some others.
Yeah.
So how long was it in the incubator? 2 years. While they went through their, what do we need? How big does it need to be? Where's it going to go? All that. So 4 years from beginning to end. We're at least double that everywhere.
Yeah.
And especially to the West. So that's one thing we got to work on. Now, why is that? Well, Texas, you probably can construct all year round. We don't have the same luxury here, especially in the mountains. There's places you got a 2-month or 3-month window where you can do anything. So that's a challenge. So you're going to have to really, you got to have your work planned. You can't be interrupted. And therein lies some of the issues. We have a very high bar on execution. And over my lifetime and my career, it's changed tremendously in terms of the height of the bar.
Okay.
You almost can't get over it anymore.
Yeah.
And so we have tried to do the right things in the process. We pancake thing on top of thing on top of thing, and it becomes undoable. One of the things that Trans Mountain ran into with the execution of the expansion project was overlapping regulation, limited windows under which you could construct.
Yeah.
If there was a nesting bird, and not necessarily an endangered species, but just a nesting bird, it disrupted construction.
Yeah.
They built nests on some of our equipment. We couldn't move the equipment. They built nests where construction was going to happen. We had to basically construct around. So you're inefficiently executing.
Yeah.
You construct to a point, stop, pick up, move, go back, fill in. And so we've made the regulatory burden so high and so uncertain that it adds enormously to cost. And it's not that long ago. You can look back and you'll see projects executed for what would be, if you grossed up the cost, what the early estimates for Northern Gateway were, or the original Trans Mountain expansion problems. One of the things we get hit with all the time is, well, this project went up in cost by 8 times or whatever. It's like, well, the world changed from conception to when it actually began executing. Mm-hmm. And then other things happened. Yeah. Fires, floods, COVID, whatever. If I go back in Trans Mountain's history, they executed a project that added a critical piece of what became TMX later in the Jasper National Park and Mount Robson Provincial Park. That was done in the mid-2000s. It was done for about $550 million. And it was about an eighth of the construction we would do later. Mm-hmm. So you think about that, okay, 600 times 8, $4.8 billion and a bunch of other stuff. You get to the 5, whatever the number was in the old days. Yeah. There's another project under construction, same area today by some other company for about $4 billion. Times 8 or 32. And that doesn't include, building through Vancouver and a bunch of other stuff, which is a challenge. And so like something went wrong between 2005-ish and when this company really started executing in 19. So, and that's all of these, conditions have multiplied, the rules have multiplied, you have overlapping regulation, you have an incredibly difficult environment to construct in just to begin with because of the mountains and other. Yeah. So that's a bit of a comparison. So if you're a person putting capital to work and you go, well, I can do in the US, I can incubate it for 2 years, not spend very much money in the incubation period, and then I announce it and I do my lands and acquisition in that first year and I construct the fourth year, the amount of capital you have dead on the balance sheet is relatively, it's short or it's contained. You can afford to warehouse that. Yeah. If you got a decade-long process here, it's a whole other animal.
Totally.
And if you have to spend billions to get to yes, you're worried about that decision.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then you're going to spend billions before you generate $1 of revenue. Exactly. You touched, Mark, on the cost escalation, and I know you've spoken about that quite a few times, but maybe for our listeners, unpack some of that. And you talked a bit about very briefly that floods, fires, COVID, et cetera, but also the work stoppages and the moving around things. How much was just sheer bad luck and unfortunate timing of certain things versus things you think we could do better and make it easier, less costly for companies?
Well, one of the things I'm really encouraged by, again, is the tone from government and the institution or the creation of the Major Projects Office. The concept of being able to shepherd a project through the system is, I think, a big step in the right direction. So let's just start there. And I know they're working hard on, okay, what happened? Using my little story of 2005 to 2019, what happened? Yeah. And what have we done? And I think a lot of it was risk aversion. Like we have to be perfect. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have to be perfect, it's going to be incredibly expensive. So what are we prepared to do a little different or take a little bit of risk on and get to a more cost-effective outcome? So that's one thing. But for us, the exogenous events were big deals. COVID was incredibly disruptive to productivity. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. The fire environment, so that limited the amount of hours people could work. You had to shut down by a certain point in the day. So that wasn't particularly efficient. The flooding, the atmospheric river was a big event in terms of how much it threw off the next year's plan because basically it kept us from clearing. I mentioned birds. Kept us from clearing in critical areas the year before. So the next year you had to clear and then deal with birds. And so it massively disrupted construction. That's one where I would say those three things stand out. The other really was, I would say, availability of really experienced labor. We had lots of great contractors on this, but because of the quiet period, a lot of people who did, welding for a living or other, skilled trades, that pool of talent wasn't as deep. And there was competing, with the CGL under construction, the dam under construction in BC. and then our project, it really pulled hard on the labor.
Yeah. 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 Obviously, the person leading the major projects office had a front row seat to getting this project. We're speaking of Don Farrell, one of the founders of BCA, interestingly. But do you see the learnings of the Trans Mountain project are being brought into how do we do things better going forward and make it easier to A, get a yes at an FID basis, and then B, on an actual project basis?
I think that's most definitely where they're headed. Like we are, I think, in great hands with her heading up that office. We were there just a few days ago. We were going over recommendations we made earlier in the year about regulatory improvements in the country. So we had a list we went through, and it was sitting next to Don, and she's circling stuff because she knew it. She goes, yep, and it's stuff that it's become part of the fabric of the MP, the MPO. And so it was like, okay, so I think she was happy with, okay, we talked about this earlier in the year, and it was picked up in their kind of their founding documents and what their mission is. And so I was like, check, good. We're getting the right things. And that, like, to see that was like, good. She's got a huge task ahead of her, lots to sort through. But I think the country's in great hands.
Yeah.
And she's doing it because she loves Canada. That's why she's there.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. I keep telling her she's doing a terrible job at retiring, but
yeah. Third time maybe is a charm.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. A predecessor of Don's, Ian Anderson, you mentioned him a little while ago. Sort of has a reputation for having walked every kilometer of the line and handed out his cell phone number. And I'm thinking more specifically on the Indigenous side, and that's a critical piece of future projects. But how did Trans Mountain and the expansion project win over the Indigenous communities along the route and generally get to a yes and a place of agreement and consent there?
Yeah, well, one of the things that the country owes him a lot, because when many lesser people would have let the project go, he didn't let that happen. And so he kept it alive in various points along the way when others would have just said, this is enough.
Yeah.
And he never packed his tent and left on that. You could, Sisyphus can only push the rock so long, and eventually he's like, I need to retire. But like that his like number one thing that he talked about when I came on was, I made the Indigenous file and the relations and trying to understand and learn. He says, that was my file. That was my thing to work on. Mm-hmm. He made it his own. And so that, I think it was well understood, whether the nation supported the project or not, they respected the person who showed up and wanted to learn about them, their community, their interests, their worries, and maybe how Trans Mountain could help.
Yeah.
His touch on that, so something will come up now, I'll go pick up the phone. Hey, can you tell me about this? Or let's go grab dinner or lunch or whatever. And because he's got such a great memory and that past, that history is so rich.
Yeah. What do you think with the recent Canada-Alberta MOU? There's lots of talk of the excitement around another West Coast pipeline, and frankly, there's pipelines we should be doing in every direction out of Alberta. But what do you think are going to be the critical ingredients to a successful project, both from an applicant perspective, and then if you had your magic wand, what would you sort of 3 things you'd change from the regulatory decision-making perspective?
Well, first off, maybe start with what I think the conditions are that are needed. A lot of it's been touched on by others, and they think they do a pretty good job of explaining it, but there has to be appropriate consultation with Indigenous nations, whatever the route is. Mm-hmm. British Columbia has to see, that there's this is important for the country, and I think generally that's there. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would probably point out as being really important is we can't have overlapping regulation.
Yeah.
And that was, again, one of the bugaboos in our project was, you have, even within a particular regulator, you may see different application region to region of a particular set of rules. So that's an issue. And then you may have overlapping provincial, federal, even local engagement on stuff. So that needs to be simplified. One-stop shop is going to be important.
Yeah. Yeah. One project, one decision, one approval, that kind of one window approach, which the MPO is clearly trying to achieve, I think will be fundamental. We just cannot keep asking companies to go various departments federally, various departments provincially, and as you even point out, some obstacles at the local level. There's places like Texas that'll make it far easier to do it, as you pointed out earlier. Mark, you've got your own potential for expansion on the project. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what you have planned there.
Sure. As we came into the year, came out of last year, a few months on the job, I was like, okay, let's start looking at what we need to do next. And this is coming from, again, decades in the space and have constantly see us run out of space. And it's like, we don't want to be in that position as a country or for the customer base. So, okay, what can we do? Optimize the kit we have is what I say over and over again. You'll hear me say that. What's out there? And we had done some work in the background in 24. And so began talking about, well, our next thing is putting more horsepower effectively on the line we just built, take it to its full hydraulic capability. So that, should be about 350,000 barrels a day incremental to what we already have in place. The other thing we are working on, which is two smaller projects, but one is to use DRA, drag reducing agent on the system. That could be in place in early 27. That would add about 80 to 90,000 on the system. That's a no impact thing. It's a little bit of work inside the fence lines at various pump stations, and then you get a little bit better performance out of the pipeline. That's one, again, we'll look at coming to investment decision here in 26 and run an open season on it. It's basically a very straightforward project. But then that adds a little increment of capacity early 27. Yeah. Another chunk for us comes in 29-ish. We're trying to pull time out of that, but it's challenging given the environment we operate in.
Yeah.
The other guys are doing the same thing. And Enbridge has announced some expansions near term and then some longer term. And I know South Bow's looking as well. And everyone should be doing that because it's logical and it keeps us ahead of the wave of oil.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then eventually the premier's objectives in the province are tremendous.
Yeah, double production.
And so you need more pipe and maybe lots of different directions, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you look back, knowing what you know now, should we have doubled the expansion? Should we have made the expansion project bigger in hindsight?
That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that one. It's very tough to do two things at once in the corridor we operated in. And in some places you just can't. I think you've probably seen some of the pictures from, and I tell you, no picture does some of the territory we went through justice. Yeah. You have to see it to really understand it. And you go, oh, I get it. Like just to see building along the ledges on some of the mountains, or the rivers we had to cross, even Burnaby, the terminal. When you stand at the back of that facility and you look down, you're looking across the top of 3 to 4 rows of tanks because it steps down so steep. Yeah, and so the amount of earthwork and seismic reinforcement and all that, it would have been tough to do double.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's just sort of wishful thinking, but yeah.
Building two pipelines alongside each other at the same time isn't easy.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, one's hard enough. Yeah, exactly. As we move to wrap, Mark, is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to share or talk about, leave with our listeners?
Yeah, one is just the pay to the owner this year will be about $1.7 billion.
Wow.
So that's pretty good. And I have a hit list of things that people have said in the past that are going to prove not to be true. One of them is that we'll never pay any money back. Well, here you go. And there's a whole bunch of those things that have been said over the years about the pipeline and its competitiveness and it'll never flow full and all this other stuff. And every day the thing runs, it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's enhancing, value for the Canadian crude oil. It's preventing a wealth transfer to another country by its simple existence. You've seen some of the numbers from the producer community in terms of how their margins have improved. Yep. And we're happy about that. Yeah, because that's money in the country and wealth in the country. And so we want to stay in front of. The basin doesn't want to be caught short capacity. And so we got to get after that. That's my last message. And by the way, again, that $1.7 billion is nice.
It's nothing to sneeze at. Yeah, no, absolutely. We always try and end on an optimistic note. Mark, what makes you optimistic about the future of Alberta and the future of Canada?
Well, first off, I am an optimist by nature. I think you have to be in this space. But first off, I think the tone is so different now than it was not long ago. Mm-hmm. The opportunity to have another boom for the oil business in the country and the energy business generally, and it's going into a global market that needs it. In Canada, there's nobody better positioned that'll do it more responsibly than people in this country. And so I have lots of reasons to be optimistic. And I think about, career ahead for others. People should think about the energy business as a place to have a career. Mine will be 40 years next year. I never in a million years, would have thought I ended up where I ended up. There is a tremendous opportunity in this sector, and people leaving university or going into university should think about engineering and geology and green energy and technology and AI, and because all of that is here in this space.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, it's been an industry and a series of occupations that people have been looking on as sunset, right? And they're very much not.
Well, twilight in the desert never happened. Here we are. Yeah, and we're still here. Based on numbers from the forecasters about supply demand, oil's going to be needed for a long time to come, and Canada has an enormous role to play in that picture.
Yeah, totally agree. What a great way to end. Mark, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, appreciate it.
You've been listening to C-Suite Unplugged. As always, it's a privilege to spend some time with the leading executives of our membership. Thank you to our guests this month for sharing their journey and insights. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to review and share the podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time with more unfiltered leadership stories from the C-Suite.